The views and opinions expressed on America's Workforce Union podcast and its digital media channels are solely those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views and opinions of the producers or sponsors.
Welcome to the America's Workforce Radio Podcast, the flagship production of the American Workers Radio and Podcast Network, where organized labor and its never-ending fight to protect the rights of the American worker come first. Now, presented by LIUNA, Laborers International Union of North America. Here's your host, Ed Flash Ferens.
SAG-AFTRA reaches a deal with the motion picture and TV industry. Meanwhile, IATSE files an unfair labor practice charge over the closing of the Kennedy Center. And today on the show, the Economic Policy Institute and labor lawyer Andrew Strom will be joining us. Welcome to the Friday, May 8th edition of America's Workforce, where we're available on at least 5 platforms. That includes YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. We have 2 guests on the show today. Jennifer Sherer will be our first guest. She is Deputy Director of State Policy and Research and Director of the State Worker Power Initiative for the Economic Policy Institute. This is one great organization. They are affiliated with the AFL-CIO, so that's a good thing right there. The website is epi.org. Jen's been on the show a couple of times. She's been out with a number of publications, including reports and articles on labor unions, public sector collective bargaining, right to work laws, child labor, worker misclassification, wage theft, women's labor education, labor oral history, and working class voters. A lot of good credentials there, and she is going to talk about her latest research. Right now, we all know federal workers and the protections they have are under attack. Now, Jen is of the opinion that states can take important steps to protect and expand union and collective bargaining rights. States can take several important actions to shore up workers' existing labor rights, remove state-level constraints and obstacles to unionizing, and ensure that workers can more fully exercise their existing federal rights to organize and collectively bargain, such as, and this is a no-brainer, repealing so-called right-to-work laws like what they did in Michigan a couple of years ago, banning captive audience meetings, ensuring striking workers are eligible for unemployment insurance, and embedding collective bargaining rights in state constitutions, much like Illinois, what they did a couple of years ago. So Jen's going to be our first guest. Again, she's Deputy Director of the EPI's Economic Analysis and Research Network, better known as EARN. Our second guest on the show is Andrew Strom, our designated labor lawyer. He's an adjunct professor at the Brooklyn Law School. And if you go to the website onlabor.org, this was a service of the Harvard Law School, you could see some of the writings. And I don't know if this one is up yet. It's titled Loyalty Test. If it's not up, it'll be up shortly. It involves a recent court decision, a D.C. Circuit decision involving the Encore Electric Delivery Company. And this was a case where they were taking on the National Labor Relations Board. And sadly, in this case, what they did, the company basically made an appeal here to use a bad decision going back to 1953 by the U.S. Supreme Court and applied that to a decision of today. It involves a worker at this company who was a member of the IBEW, that would be Local 69, and it involves some smart meters that were being installed that caught on fire. He spoke out about it, lost his job. You know why? Because he didn't say that the union was in negotiations with the company. I kid you not. I have to thank Andrew for writing about this, because this is just one of the many ways that companies have used, through the courts to come down on workers. That's exactly what happened here. So Andrew Strom will be our second guest right here on America's Workforce. Now, a brief look into the world of labor. This segment brought to you by Boyd Watterson Asset Management. You can find more at boydwatterson.com. My union, SAG-AFTRA, has reached a tentative agreement with the motion picture and TV industry, avoiding another potential Hollywood strike. They had a strike about 3 years ago, and it lasted, I think around 6 or 7 weeks, I believe. Now, this deal covers film, TV, streaming, and new media, though specific terms have not been disclosed. Now, the talks began February 9th and centered on key union priorities, such as stronger protections and compensation related to generative AI, as well as higher wages to address inflation and healthcare eligibility challenges. Now, with AI content becoming more and more prevalent, union leadership has emphasized the goal of ensuring AI-generated performances require consent and are compensated at levels comparable to human actors. This deal comes on the heels of the Writers Guild ratifying its agreement with the same group. Now, the SAG-AFTRA agreement must still be approved by the members. That should be coming in the next couple of weeks now. Meanwhile, the International Alliance of Theatrical and Stage Employees, better known as IATSE, has filed unfair labor practice charges with the NLRB against the Kennedy Center, alleging unlawful layoffs ahead of the planned 2-year closure for renovations. The union claims the center terminated workers in ticketing, group sales, and subscriptions without bargaining over the effects of the shutdown as required under the collective bargaining agreement and federal labor law. Now, while IATSE argues the layoffs are an attempt to permanently eliminate union jobs, the Kennedy Center maintains the closure is necessary for long overdue repairs. Now, the layoffs took effect April 27th, with officials indicating the positions would not be replaced. The dispute arises amid broader controversy over the closure, which is also being challenged in court. All right, we are going to take a quick break. When we come back, Jen Sherer on behalf of the Economic Policy Institute right here on America's Workforce. Don't go away.
You're listening to America's Workforce with Ed Flash Ferens.
It takes LIUNA to build North America's infrastructure. From roads and bridges to schools and skyscrapers, the men and women of LIUNA, the Laborers International Union of North America, build the projects we depend on. From constructing the Freedom Tower on the site of the former World Trade Center to untangling Washington, D.C.'s congested interstate, LIUNA members do the work that matters. Find out what it takes to be built by LIUNA at liuna.org. That's liuna.org.
America's Workforce is presented by the Laborers International Union of North America. Feel the power right now at liuna.org.
America's Workforce is sponsored in part by Boyd Watterson Asset Management, LLC. Find out more about our investment solutions tailored to meet the needs of Taft-Hartley funds at boydwatterson.com.
American workers are sick of struggling to get by. It's time to get ahead. In the Teamsters Union, workers are winning industry-leading contracts, historically high wages, fully paid health care, and retirement benefits you can count on. Across the country, Teamsters fight alongside our brothers and sisters to secure a better life. It's what we've been doing and how we've been living for more than a century. When we fight, we win. Join us. Be a Teamster.
Now, back to America's Workforce. Here's Ed Flash Ferens.
And don't forget, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast, AWF Union Podcast. You know, despite all the attacks on unions, we're seeing a whole lot of organizing going on in various states, many states that are not what you call union friendly, but the landscape is changing slowly but surely, especially with some elections. And joining us as our featured guest today is Jennifer Sherer, who is Deputy Director of the Economic Policy Institute's Economic Analysis and Research Network, better known as EARN, where she directs EARN's Worker Power Project. I just like saying that, worker power. You know what? A lot of people do not realize, as a worker, how much power they actually have, especially at the voting booth. Jennifer, welcome back to America's Workforce. Thanks for joining us. There's a lot of good things happening in various states, like I referenced. But first, why don't you update our listeners here? We get new listeners to the show each and every day here on America's Workforce. A little background on yourself and more specifically, what EARN is all about. Let's start right there. Go ahead.
Sure. Folks might be familiar with Economic Policy Institute, EPI.org, which is a national think tank that focuses on conditions of low and middle income workers and advancing policies that improve outcomes for workers. And our EARN network, Economic Analysis and Research Network, is a network of over 60 state and local organizations across the country that we support and work with, who are also advancing policies that improve outcomes for workers in their states. That's how we're focusing on building worker power, working with labor unions and labor federations on the state and local level. And I know what we're going to talk about today is particularly on expanding access to collective bargaining and union contracts, which so many workers are expressing interest in and enthusiasm for, but in too many cases still facing a lot of obstacles in trying to get to forming a union and winning a union contract.
We should also mention that you first became active in labor. This was like 25 plus years ago as a local union officer. Take me back to that time. What did you actually do, and which union was that?
Yeah, my first union was UE, United Electrical Workers, and we were actually the first graduate employee union to affiliate with UE at University of Iowa, where I was a grad student. So I got to be part of, some of the early days of building a new union right after a successful election and bargaining some of the first contracts, which really gave me a crash course in both how important and transformative the process of collective bargaining can be for changing the balance of power and the conditions of a large group of workers. It also exposed me to the labor world more generally, right? I got to participate in the life of the regional and the national union and meet workers from a lot of different industries and sectors and learn from the struggles that they were going through. Really ended up sort of putting me on a path. Most of my career was in labor education, working with a long list of different private and public sector unions in Iowa and the Midwest, which is where I'm still based.
Well, with all that being said, you are a perfect fit for this show because this show is 100% union. And we talk about unions each and every day here on America's Workforce. So what I want to focus on today is the contrast here. We're seeing a lot of attacks on unions, especially in the federal sector. We'll get into that, but it's a little bit different in some states. I know states have picked up what the federal government is not doing when it comes to union activity. Talk to me about some changes here, and this is quite a contrast. Virginia and Florida. Virginia seems to be going down the right path when it comes to workers. Explain what's happening here.
Yeah, we've had some really, really exciting news rolling out of Virginia over the last few weeks and months. So in the collective bargaining arena, Virginia, in a span of only about 5 years, has gone from a state where there was a 40-year ban in place on collective bargaining for public employees to a state that now, just a few weeks ago, the General Assembly passed a transformative, comprehensive, statewide, strong collective bargaining law covering almost all state and local government employees in the state and also covering home care workers, who, as folks might know, are otherwise not covered. They are excluded under federal labor law, and so they don't have the same equal rights that most workers do. It's a breakthrough, particularly in a southern state that historically has had a significant number of anti-union policies on the books and, is estimated to create and open up a new pathway to collective bargaining for probably about 500,000 workers, a really significant large number of frontline workers in the state. And of course, a lot of workers who are in occupations that have been underpaid compared to their peers with similar education and experience. That's a lot of the analysis we've done at EPI to take a look at why public employee collective bargaining is so important. And in occupations where women and workers of color are overrepresented. Really, really transformative for closing some of those public sector pay gaps and closing some of the persistent problems we have across our country with racial and gender wage gaps and inequities in Virginia.
So, as you pointed out, this has been a slow process, and it seems to have accelerated after the elections of last November. You got a Democrat there that's now a governor. And I remember the state federation over there in Virginia was pretty excited about that because this is a right to work state. And the governor made some comments about, well, I don't know if we can repeal all of right to work. You gotta fill me in on this one because, we saw what happened in Michigan. Michigan went right to work. This was well over a decade ago. They flipped it. Explain what's going on. And more importantly, you think we'll be able to knock out right to work in Virginia?
I do. I think there's a growing trend across the country of workers and state policymakers recognizing right to work for what it is. It is an anti-union, misnamed law that doesn't give anybody any rights or any rights to a job. What it does is it constrains and restricts people's ability to collectively bargain and to form and maintain unions, strong unions. The right-wing anti-union groups have for decades confused and misled people about that. And I think in the last decade, we've really seen a breakthrough. And the trend consistently across multiple states has been no new right to work laws have passed, despite the right wing continuing to try to introduce them in some places. And we've seen multiple states rejecting or flipping, as you noted, Michigan being the most notable recent example. Missouri also, when their Republican-dominated legislature tried to impose right to work, voters said, no, we don't want that in our state, and ran a ballot initiative and soundly defeated it. We're seeing that as the new trend, and I think we are about to see in states like Virginia, people will be coming back with that proposal in years to come and building the case for repealing it. It's a tougher climb in a state like Virginia, whereas you described Michigan, where a right to work bill had been introduced and passed in the early 2010s in a state that had never had right to work legislation. So it was very unfamiliar for Michigan workers, and they were ready to go back to their non-right to work state as soon as they had the opportunity. Virginia has had a right to work law in place since the 1940s. It's a long education process, and people are in the process of building the case for why it's time to, along with this big breakthrough on public sector bargaining in Virginia, also repeal that right to work statute. And I just want to note there are similar campaigns and live discussions going on in places like Kentucky, which is a little bit like the Michigan case. Didn't have a right to work law, passed one in the 21st century, and workers are coming together now with a more proactive campaign to say, this is not working for our state. We want to flip it back the way it was. Wisconsin, another one of those examples, a lot like Michigan, where people are building and preparing for the opportunity to repeal the right to work law that got imposed on them after the 2010 elections. So I think we're going to see a lot more activity in that arena in the next few years. Yes.
And I recall Tennessee decided to enshrine right to work into their state constitution. When that happens, Jen, I would imagine it makes it that much more difficult to repeal when you have something like that. Don't you need a clear majority to overturn something like that?
Oh, yeah, that is also true. That's been a trend across a handful of southern states that already had right to work laws in place. Again, often those are campaigns that are being funded and run and imposed almost by national conservative groups rather than in-state interests. But yes, digging out of the right to work hole in some of those states is going to be an even longer process. But that doesn't mean people aren't beginning to work on it, because I'm seeing that crop up all over the country. And I think the counterpart to that is a little bit less well known is that there are several other states that are doing the hard work of embedding collective bargaining rights in their state constitutions. There are a handful of states that have had language like that for quite some time, but the more recent trend is states like Illinois recently added constitutional language and had huge supermajority of voters across the state approve a new constitutional amendment enshrining the right to collectively bargain and rejection of so-called right to work language in their state. So going the other direction, again, there's a very similar ballot initiative for a constitutional amendment scheduled for this fall in Vermont. So we've definitely got the counter trend happening in multiple states as well.
Our guest today is Jennifer Sherer. She's Deputy Director of the Economic Policy Institute's Economic Analysis and Research Network, better known as EARN. Let's talk about Florida. We're talking about states here. And let's be honest, Florida is a right-to-work state. And the governor there, Ron DeSantis, well, he's attacked unions, especially in the public sector, seems to be kind of friendly to police and fire, which is a typical method to get legislation passed. But isn't he really, and the legislature there, gung-ho on trying to do whatever they can to get rid of teachers' unions, especially?
Yeah, he's been very explicit. Again, this is legislation in Florida that has been documented through a lot of FOIA requests and reporters that are studying some of the correspondence going back and forth with legislators. This legislation and the campaign to try to destroy public education and public education unions in Florida is being led by out-of-state groups like the so-called Freedom Foundation, Americans for Prosperity. And this has been a multi-year priority of Governor DeSantis and some of the Republican leaders in the legislature. There have already been several rounds of harsh anti-union legislation passed. This year, the legislature just passed yet another bill that is designed to make it as hard as possible for public sector unions to maintain their existence. I think that's the best way to put it. Yeah. So Florida, interestingly, is one of the handful of states in the country where workers, via the state constitution, have the right to collectively bargain. It is enshrined in their state constitution. And I think you have to sort of step back and look at Florida and say, that's probably one of the reasons that the legislature hasn't done what Wisconsin or Utah tried to do recently, or, just repeal or try to ban collective bargaining. Instead, what they've done is they keep creating all of these convoluted, complicated, bureaucratic obstacles to maintaining a union, so that workers have to jump through all kinds of hoops. And if they already have a union, have to annually keep voting over and over again, potentially, to maintain their union, which is, obviously the state imposing conditions that are designed to be impossible at some point for people to maintain the organizations that they chose to form and are choosing to be part of as members.
Yeah, we're specifically talking about those recertification drives. Jen, I got to take a quick break here. Again, Jennifer Sherer joining us on behalf of the Economic Policy Institute, EPI.org. And if you go there, you can read about what current federal law says about workers' rights to unionize and collectively bargain. I want to touch on that next. Once again, you're listening to America's Workforce. Don't go away.
You're listening to America's Workforce with Ed Flash Ferens.
There is unity and strength for workers.
We are the USW.
We are the USW.
The United Steelworkers.
The largest industrial union in North America.
We represent 850,000 members in the U.S., Canada, and the Caribbean.
We work in metals,
rubber,
chemicals,
paper,
oil refining,
atomic energy, and the service sector.
We are steelworkers, standing strong and fighting for what's right.
America's Workforce appreciates our sponsor, the Columbus Central Ohio Building and Construction Trades Council, who represents more than 18,000 workers from 19 affiliated local unions and district councils.
America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the United Steelworkers. You can find more at usw.org. This segment of the show is brought to you by the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees Division of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. For more information, please visit bmwe.org. America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the Communication Workers of America. You can find more at cwa-union.org.
Now, back to America's Workforce. Here's Ed Flash Ferens.
And remember, you can check us out on at least 5 platforms. That includes YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. And when you get an opportunity, here's what you do. Just sign up and receive our shows on a regular basis and give us a rating. Always appreciate those 5-star ratings, so please keep them coming. Let's go back to our live line and rejoin Jennifer Sherer. Jennifer's with the Economic Policy Institute. She's Deputy Director of the EPI's Economic Analysis and Research Network, better known as EARN. Prior to joining the EPI, which was back in 2021, she served as director of the University of Iowa Labor Center, leading statewide worker outreach, education, and leadership development programming in close partnership with labor unions and community organizations. She's all about unions, and she's been on a number of national media outlets, including the Washington Post, New Yorker, NBC Nightly News, and also NPR and MSNBC, which I guess is now MS Now. We changed the name of MSNBC. All right, I want to talk about federal labor law, the National Labor Relations Act, which pretty much covers private sector workers. A little bit different in the federal workforce, and we've seen an attack on unions in this current administration. A lot of that is in the courts right now, trying to be sorted out. But if you can be specific on what the law says, I mean, we got a lot of listeners. We're the #1 union podcast for 3 years in a row, Jen. And I think a lot of workers, I know they're scared. They're wondering if they're going to be at their job tomorrow or the next day or the next week. Thankfully, many of them are still in a union. Obviously, being in a union, they have union rights and all that kind of stuff. But where is the law? And I guess the other part of this question is, I know states have tried to pick up the slack here, but if you can explain the law and what is at their disposal right now when it comes to that law.
Yeah, well, our federal labor law, 1935 passed National Labor Relations Act, is still in place. As many people know, it's not the same law it was in 1935 for a number of reasons, including anti-union amendments that were passed along the way and lots of court decisions and board decisions that have narrowed some of what that law was designed to do when it was put in place. But it's still there. And it is there to guarantee and provide that workers have the right, without, on paper anyway, right, without employer interference, to form and join labor organizations for mutual aid and protection. And the federal labor law still says, covering most private sector workers, that workers have 2 options for how they go about forming a union. They can sign up 50% of their coworkers and go to their employer and say, we've got a majority who's interested in forming a union. We want you to recognize us and let's start collectively bargaining. That's one option under the law. The other option is if the employer won't voluntarily recognize, as the law implies that they should if there's already a majority, then workers can go to the National Labor Relations Board and request an election and have an election to prove that they've got the majority interested in forming a union. And then the employer, by law, is supposed to begin the collective bargaining process to seek a union contract. Now, we know that in practice, that law has been weakened and broken by decades and decades of employer hostility, highly sophisticated union-busting tactics, and the failure of Congress to step in and restore the strength of that law as it was intended when it was first passed in 1935 and address the real economic and on-the-ground workplace realities that workers are facing when they try to exercise these rights today. So we've got a lot of problems at the federal level. On top of an already weakened and broken labor law, we've got an administration in the White House right now that is openly hostile to workers and their unions, doing everything in their executive power to try to eliminate the union contracts of federal sector employees, and also installing appointees at agencies that workers depend on to protect their rights, who are openly hostile to those rights. We've got a lot of problems in our federal system, and that is, as you said, why many states are looking for ways to step in, shore up where they can, where they have the legal latitude, workers' rights, and to anticipate what do we do if we end up in a worst case scenario. I mean, we really need a strong federal labor law that covers and equalizes protections for everyone across our country. But what do we do if that system is not functioning correctly, which is where we are right now? Or worse, there are also many corporations who are trying to pursue court cases that could permanently disable the National Labor Relations Board. What do we do if they potentially pursue those kinds of cases all the way to the Supreme Court? So states are looking for ways to step in and coming up with some very innovative and novel ways to do so. Beyond some of the basics that we talked about, I mean, obviously, at a bare minimum, states should get rid of anti-union right-to-work laws that are obstacles to workers' federal labor rights. They've got latitude to legislate around workers who aren't covered, like public employees and domestic workers and farm workers. But states are also stepping in to shore up rights by doing things like banning captive audience meetings. It's one of the big problems in our federal labor law that the law says workers have a right to organize freely without coercion, without intimidation, without retaliation. But over decades, board decisions have allowed often and expanded this arena in which employers can work with anti-union consultants to intimidate and essentially create a psychological reign of terror when workers try to organize using these so-called captive audience meetings to issue threats and try to convince people not to exercise their right to unionize. So states are stepping in that arena to protect people from having to endure those, or doing things like making sure that workers who exercise their right to bargain and end up on strike or locked out by their employer are eligible for unemployment insurance, since that's a state program. So there are a lot of ways that states can also step in and shore up people's rights.
Reign of terror. You hit it right on the head there on that one, because that's exactly how so many companies treat workers when it comes to unionizing. One more question here before we wrap it up. There's a lot of people in Congress that do not like public sector unions. You've talked about what's happening in Florida right now and how they're making it so difficult to recertify elections. But on the federal level, I recall some lawmakers introducing legislation to ban across the board all federal type of unions. And obviously, states have their own public sector unions. But on the federal level, are we hearing anything about that? Is that getting any traction to your knowledge, Jen?
That is a persistent, very extremist right-wing position. And it is the kind of proposal that cropped up again in Project 2025. You know, this notion that public sector unions should just be abolished and should be made illegal. Yes, that idea is out there. But instead, what we've seen getting traction in Congress is the opposite, in fact. As Trump has attempted to step in and overnight try to strip away collectively bargained union contracts covering hundreds of thousands of federal employees who are key to making our federal government work and all of our agencies accountable to the public. Instead, what we've seen is, in surprising ways, it's one of the few areas where Congress, in a bipartisan way, has challenged the administration. So, in fact, we've had legislation put forward with bipartisan support to restore the collective bargaining rights of federal employees. And it is one of the few pieces of legislation that passed the House, defying Trump's position. I actually think it's a pretty important and solid reflection of lawmakers from both parties understanding the importance of unions, the popularity of unions, the necessity of unions for workers. That legislation has not yet passed the Senate, but it is a pretty clear signal that I think, contrary to these very extremist right-wing views that workers don't need unions and we're going to take them away from them even when workers are clear about wanting them, that is not the majority opinion across our country right now. It is not the political will of most voters. Whether you're looking at any region of the country, I think that is the direction we're more likely to see going. You know, there's a lot of obstacles to overcome because right now the White House has, a fair amount of power, particularly over federal employees. But those battles are not going to end anytime soon. And it is, you mentioned union membership ticking up a little bit in 2025, a significant portion of that uptick was among federal employees, despite all the attacks, in some cases, likely because all of the attacks. Workers really coming together and saying, not only do we want to keep the unions we have, we need to build more of them. We need to build our membership stronger to withstand these kinds of assaults that we're facing.
Yeah, I think the number was like 463,000 people joined unions in the last year, which is pretty significant considering the climate, the political climate right now. Jen, awesome podcast here. Thank you so much for joining us. You're always welcome here on America's Workforce. Jen Sherer, she's with the Economic Policy Institute. She's Deputy Director for the EPI's Economic Analysis and Research Network, better known as EARN. And you can find more at epi.org. You take care, stay safe, and stay in touch, okay?
You too. Thanks so much.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, our designated labor lawyer, Andrew Strom, will be joining us. Once again, you're listening to America's Workforce.
This is America's Workforce. More shows available at awfradio.com.
The Heat and Frost Insulators and Allied Workers are proud to be a title sponsor for America's Workforce Radio. The Insulators Union is leading the way in the mechanical insulation industry, fire stopping, and infectious disease control. Regarded as North America's energy conservation specialists, these professionals are known for their professional work and dedication. You can learn more about the Insulators Union at insulators.org. America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers. You can find more at ifpte.org. America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the Ironworkers. You can find more at ironworkers.org. America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the Heat and Frost Insulators Labor Management Cooperative Trust. Find out more at insulators.org/LMCT. Blue Cross and Blue Shield companies formed out of a need to provide affordable health care to teachers, loggers, and miners. We are now celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Blues, developing the National Labor Office to strengthen its commitment to organized labor. Blue Cross Blue Shield's National Labor Office remains focused on America's workers, advocating for affordable and equitable health care, partnering with strategic alliances to provide industry-leading products and services, and proudly serving more than 18 million unionized workers, retirees, and their families. Working hard for America's working families, for the health of America. Learn more by following them at Blue Labor on LinkedIn and X, formerly known as Twitter.
Now, back to Ed Flash Farrens with America's Workforce.
And remember, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast, AWF Union Podcast. Let's talk about labor law. Joining us on our live line, as he does just about each and every month, is Andrew Strom. Andrew is an adjunct professor at the Brooklyn Law School. We check in with him because he writes a column for the On Labor blog, which is a service of the Harvard Law School. The blog today involves a case that goes back about 13 years. It's interesting, Andrew, how the labor board, it's almost like they reached out as far back as possible to try to screw the worker in this case. Why don't you explain what happened here? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, right. So this case involves a worker named Bobby Reed, who worked for an electric utility company for 34 years.
Okay.
And was fired after 34 years on the job. And it involves testimony he gave before the Texas State Senate in October 2012. So even if he had won, I mean, the idea that you have to wait 13 years to be reinstated, or get back pay is pretty crazy. But it has kind of a crazy history because it just shows, how broken labor law is, even if it had worked in his case, which it ultimately didn't. So he's fired in early 2013. He doesn't get a decision from the NLRB until 2016. Then the employer challenges the decision, goes to court at the DC Circuit. In 2018, the DC Circuit sends the case back to the NLRB because they think they didn't fully analyze the issues properly. Then I guess COVID happens and things get slowed down further. The NLRB issues their decision in July 2024, and he wins, by the way, before the NLRB twice. And then the DC Circuit says, nah, we don't think so. So they issued their decision about a week ago. The case is called Encore Electric Delivery Company. And one thing that's like pretty shocking about this case is, I mean, it was written by one of Trump's most right-wing appointees, but her decision was joined by two Democratic appointees on the court. So you can't, this is one of those cases where you can't totally blame the Republicans for the outcome. The case involves the application of this really bad 1953 Supreme Court decision that's known as Jefferson's Standard. And that case, the Supreme Court created this idea that workers have some kind of duty of loyalty to their employer. And of course, they've never suggested that employers have a duty of loyalty to their workers, right? So it's totally a one-way street, right? So the Jefferson Standard case is a case where the technicians at this local television station in Charlotte, North Carolina, are trying to get a contract, and they're doing their traditional picketing, and it's not really having any impact. And so some of the technicians decide to make this leaflet, and they print thousands of them, and they accuse the station. The headline of the leaflet is Charlotte a second-class city? And in those days, that station had no local programming. All it did was basically rerun shows that had been broadcast in other cities. They criticized them for, showing these reruns and not having any local programming. The leaflet was signed WBT technicians. It doesn't say anything about, the labor dispute or anything. The Supreme Court at that time just thought, basically, like, that's not fair. Like, it's not fair play for the union. Like, the union needed to disclose, the workers needed to disclose that they were in a union fight so that people would discount what they said, right? And so they said, if you're disparaging the employer's product and you're not identifying that there's a labor dispute going on, then you lose the protections of the NLRB, which is, kind of a ridiculous idea that, I mean, nobody else has to sort of spell out their self-interest, I mean, the employers, when they put out ads to the public, they don't have to say, and by the way, we make a lot of money off of this product. But anyway, that was the idea, was that if you're going to disparage the employer's product, you need to identify that there's an ongoing labor dispute. And so the test, right, is that workers lose their protections if they, A, don't disclose that the disparagement is related to an ongoing labor dispute, or B, the statements are, quote, so disloyal, reckless, or maliciously untrue as to lose the NLRA's protection. And so this guy, Bobby Reed, he was the lead negotiator for the union. They had their negotiations, and he told them during the negotiations, I guess the hearing was scheduled for the next day, and he said, if we don't settle today, by the way, I'm going to go to this hearing. And the hearing was about these smart meters, and the smart meters are the electric meters that can be read remotely. It's bad for workers because, it leads to layoffs, but it was also bad for workers because there had been repeated incidents of the smart meters burning up, as well as the meter bases. He comes to the hearing. There were 27 incidents of this, right, where this had happened that he had documented. And he, in his own life on the job, had once suffered second-degree burns. So he knew firsthand, like, this was a real issue for workers, that they could get burned from these meters. So he goes to testify before the hearing, before the Senate. He only gets 2 minutes to testify, and he talks about the meters burning up. The company fires him. They claim that his testimony was false. That's their reason for firing him. There's a long trial before the, administrative law judge at the NLRB who says, his testimony wasn't false. I mean, it was a little bit inaccurate because it turned out that the real issue wasn't the smart meters themselves. It had to do with the way the meters connected to the bases. And so that was what was causing the fires. It wasn't just that the meters were spontaneously combusting. But, he said that's not really, it's not accurate completely, but it's not like he made up a bunch of lies. That was why the ALJ and the board ordered him to be reinstated. The DC Circuit says, oh no, he doesn't get the protections of this act because he didn't identify, when he went to testify, he didn't add, basically he was supposed to add this one sentence to his testimony. And we're currently in contract negotiations with the company. And this was such a ridiculous application of the Jefferson Standard case because, in the Jefferson Standard case, I mean, as bad as the decision was, there's a tiny bit of logic to it in that they're handing out these leaflets to thousands of people on the street. People are getting them all over the place. They don't know. It's sort of like how, in political campaigns, you're supposed to identify which PAC is behind the ad or, which candidate is behind the ad, right? This idea that they shouldn't just be putting out leaflets that aren't explaining that the union is behind this ad. But in this Encore case, he goes to testify before the NLRB before the state Senate. And the NLRB said, this isn't the same as handing out leaflets to the public. This is a legislature. I mean, when people come to the legislature to give testimony, they expect to be lobbied. They know that the people who testify before the committees, who spent the time to go down to the state capitol and, spend half a day waiting around so they can give their testimony, that many of them have some kind of unstated interest, and that's why they show up. And it wasn't like the state Senate was fooled by this, and thought, oh, he's some disinterested expert who's just coming here for no reason. I mean, he identified himself as coming from the union. It wasn't like anybody thought otherwise. But no, they're like, no, this is their statement. Disparaging statements are only protected insofar as they're part of an appeal for support in a labor dispute. And this is sort of a follow-up to the last time I was on when I talked about how workers don't have First Amendment protections on the job, against their employers, at least in the private sector. I mean, you'd think if you give essentially truthful testimony to a state legislature, that you couldn't get fired for that, right? You would think that some law would protect you from being fired for testifying before, telling the state legislative body that, there had been this issue, 27 instances where, these meter bases, the meters and meter bases had burned up, and that the legislature should look into that. But no, apparently, the DC Circuit's like, no, if you don't utter the right magic words, you lose.
Yeah.
And it's really, it's very sad, I think.
It sounds to me that it sounds like he was a whistleblower. I mean, he was trying to do a public service. The smart meters were blowing up. Why they were blowing up, who knows? I mean, he was calling attention to a serious matter here, and then he gets reprimanded. So what I'm reading here in this conversation, what I'm reading into, is they used a bad decision to make another bad decision.
To make a worse decision. Yeah, they took what was already a bad decision and made it worse. Yeah. It's like they gave the worst possible reading to this 1953 decision.
Andrew, another question here. Now, this was a D.C. Circuit decision that went against the National Labor Relations Board, and they went back to 1953 to come down on this worker, who, by the way, is a member of Local 69 of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. Any recourse here? Can we appeal this, or is this done?
I mean, if we lived in a more normal era, you could try to go to the Supreme Court. But you and I know how that would turn out. I mean, if you can't win before 2 Democratic appointees out of a 3-judge panel, you're not going to win before 6 Republican appointees on the Supreme Court. So this is effectively the last word. I assume this guy's probably retired by now. I mean, if he'd been 34 years on the job 13 years ago, he may be retired by now.
Yeah.
It's very sad. It's sad for him personally, but it's just a sad reflection of the way in which, these courts just have no regard for, I would say, like, the realities of labor management relations and offering protections. This is a law that was supposed to protect workers. I mean, I think they forget that.
Supposed to protect workers. That's the key phrase there. All right, Andrew, we'll leave it on that note. Andrew Strom, on behalf of the On Labor blog, adjunct professor also at the Brooklyn Law School, our labor law expert here on America's Workforce. You take care. I'm sure there's more to talk about in the months to come. Okay, brother?
All right.
And that'll be it for another edition of America's Workforce. Coming up on Monday, more from SAG-AFTRA and the Economic Policy Institute. Until then, All of you have a safe and wonderful weekend.
That concludes another episode of the America's Workforce Radio Podcast. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a show. America's Workforce is a production of Labor Tools and BMA Media Group. Find out more information online at labortools.com.